Again, I welcome all of you. Thank you for making time. And I would like now to introduce Brian Locke to give us an initial overall cheese one-on-one, a little bit of a history. And I see Brian is now, yep, exactly, perfect. Here's the presentation. Brian.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Daniel, and welcome everyone. Excited to be here and excited to be able to do this. As we were saying, this is sort of a Cheese 101 specialty cheese training. I had the honor of seeing some of the pre-submitted questions before, and I'm very hopeful that through this next 20-ish minutes here, we can not only answer a lot of them, but hopefully have a bit of repetition throughout the presentation to help make it sink in. We'll go through the history of the cheese making, a very basic 101, of course, on how cheese is made. And then one of the great reasons on why we're all gathered here today is PDO and what it means and how it can help define a lot of the cheese types that we're going to actually get to taste later today. So we'll go through some of the countries. And then what's so interesting about PDO is you wouldn't just have a PDO of France. It needs to be from a very specific region in a very specific way. So we'll try to show a map to bring it home and add some clarity as to where those cheeses are being produced. So the history of cheese making, when did it start? Cheese making really started when animals became domesticated, in particular mammals. And people started to notice that the calves of the animals, or the young ones, were drinking the milk from a lactating mammal. They tried it. Turns out it was good, nutritious, protein, all those things. But thousands of years ago, there was no refrigerator. There was no grocery store to go to. So a logistics issue started and a spoilage issue started. So people started to, what they had was the stomachs from certain animals. They would carry the milk around in those stomachs. In the stomach of animals is rennet. So the rennet would cause the milk to coagulate. And that's really how early cheese making started. It added some shelf life and it evolved from there. The oldest of man-made foods, which makes a lot of fun, even before bread and wine. In particular, in the United States and in Europe, the cheeses are coming from three main types of animal: cow, goat, and sheep. Now, there are very specific cheeses that don't come from that, like Bufala mozzarella, or, I always think of a Meet the Parents, Meet the Fockers kind of movie and chuckle to myself. Basically, a mammal, the mammal milks, you can make cheese. A friend of mine had some cheese once from yak and didn't want to go back. We'll get into some of the specifics of why those specific animals will create a PDO cheese a little bit later on. But I wanted to also just quickly touch on cheese making 101. And you start with the milk, because the milk is probably 90% of the costs that you're going to have. And you have three classifications of milk: raw milk, thermalized or heat treated, and pasteurized. Raw milk, to cheese aficionados, is quite unique and quite important. And it can be required, especially for some of the cheeses that we'll touch on later, like Parmigiano Reggiano or Gruyere. Interesting side note about that, you can sell raw milk cheeses in the United States, but they have to be aged over 60 days, which is why we won't have some of the more popular raw milk cheeses from France due to shelf life once it would land into this country. Thermalized or heat treated, the FDA still considers raw milk, but those producers like to say, kills some of the risky bacteria, keeps some of the good, and offers another unique cheese platform. And then widely used throughout the United States for sure is pasteurized. And the acronym there that gets used in this industry all the time is HTST, high temperature short time, 161 degrees for 15 seconds. And if you just kind of imagine a series of pipes very close together, it gets heated, and by the top it's cooled, because you don't want to damage the milk any further than you need to, or overcook the milk any further than you need to. It would create a different cheese experience. So not to get too much into it, but there's four basic ingredients to cheese. You have milk, salt, rennet, and cultures. Cultures are one of the key ingredients when it might give it some of the flavor. If you're going to make a Parmesan, you would get a Parmesan culture, for example. A Gouda, there's Gouda style cultures to add. There are culture houses in the world that have tens of thousands of different recipes. So a cheesemaker can really kind of play mad scientist and create whatever they want. Or for some of the PDO cheeses that we will touch on later, it has to be very, very specific. The reason I wanted to make sure to touch on cultures is, again, because it's one of 4 key ingredients in all cheeses, and they're classified in 2 different ways: mesophilic and thermophilic. And thermophilic is kind of important because it can tolerate temperatures very well. And so if you're making a pasta filata style cheese, when you get the curd, after you make the curd, you're going to heat it up with hot water so it can come out of a tube, and it's going to look like vanilla ice cream coming out of a dispenser at McDonald's. That hot water is also something else that those cultures need to be able to withstand. And when you cook hard cheeses like a Parmigiano Reggiano or a domestic parm, you're going to cook the milk. You're going to cook the curd a little bit longer at a higher temperature to help get some of the excess moisture out. And that's where the thermophilic culture would come in. But I think it's just mostly important that it really helps in the flavor profile of it. All right, the reason I wanted to show this slide, I mean, we can articulate it all day long, but annatto, there's a lot of passion for anyone who eats cheese around, is the yellow cheese better than the white cheese, perhaps? So annatto is really a tasteless, colorless, calorieless seed that gets added to either certain types of cheese like a Colby, imported cheeses like a Mimolette, or there's a standard of identity where a typical Gouda cheese will have something like a beta carotene, which is a similar coloring agent to give it that bit of a hue. But there's always a lot of passion depending on where you are in the United States. Even in the Northeast, the cheese is white. In the Midwest here in Wisconsin, if the cheese isn't yellow, it doesn't sell. So rennet is another one of those 4 key ingredients in the cheese making process. And as I was saying before, animal rennet, which is very, very common in European cheese making and often required for certain PDO cheeses, actually uses the lining from the 4th stomach of calves, kids, or lambs. And that is, it's certainly, cheese aficionados, as I was saying before, anyone very close to it with a very sensitive palate can say that they can taste the different type of rennet that's used, versus the other most common is microbial. It's made in the lab. And it does say suitable for vegetarians on the screen, but I think it's just often used as some people are animal wealth. They think it's an animal welfare issue, even though I would disagree. That's perhaps a discussion for a different day. But those are the 2 most common types of rennet used to, again, coagulate that milk, start to get it to form into curds. The third is a vegetable rennet, and I'm not even sure that I've ever had a vegetable rennet cheese, to be honest with you. And it's made from fig juice or thistles or dried caper leaves, just a little something to commonly use in a few specialty cheeses from the Mediterranean. This is something that's quite interesting to me, and all cheesemakers have to deal with this one way or the other. And you're going to cut the curd and then you're going to press the curd. How are you going to do it? So if you're making blue cheese, which is kind of pictured here on the left, you would very delicately pour the curd into a form. And if you can picture a full blue cheese size wheel, that's probably the size of the form. The form would just be taller. And there's going to be holes in that form. And when we say gravity pressed, gravity over time is just going to take that way out, and the wheel will reduce in height. Of course, you'll do some flipping, but there's no mechanical pressing. Because if you mechanical press a blue cheese, you're going to press all of the air out, and that would really limit the amount of blue veining that could then take place in that product. Flip side of that, to mechanically press something when you're making a Parmesan or a harder grating cheese, you would cut the curds up very, very fine before you put it into the press, and then squeeze all of the whey and as much moisture out as you can, because often with those type of cheeses, for the standard of identity, domestic Parmesan, I think, is 32%. You really need to get off on the right foot and expel as much moisture as possible. Salt. So there probably could be 50 pages on salt, actually. I think the way that I like to describe it is a natural preservative. Again, cheese has a very, very simplistic ingredient statement, which is nice. So salt is our natural preservative. And then to get into some specifics, what is this? What's going on in this picture in the lower right? Well, when you make cheeses like a mozzarella, a pasta filata, we can use, for example, after it's made, you need to not only cool the cheese down, but you do want to add salt uptake to it. So you would put it in, that's a brine tank, very, very salty water, for about 4 hours or however long, depending on the cheese style or the unique recipe that you're wanting to make. But those brine tanks are quite cool and interesting, and often they can go 6, 7, 10 feet under the floor level, sit there for a while as they're marinating in brine. So hopefully that was the highly scientific and factual version of how cheese is made. The art of it all is the affinage. And I really think some of the other speakers, I'm sure, will touch on, maybe it's the wood boards, maybe it's how it's cured. Roquefort is cured in certain caves in France, and the environment that it's, the microbiological environment that's happening as the affinage is going on. I mean, there's certain cheeses, no spoiler alerts here, that an affineur can go up to knock on the cheese, and just by the sound of it, they can tell how it's developing. So that's the fun romance and art of it all. PDO. So PDO stands for Protected Designation of Origin. And what's important to note is PDO is basically the European Union's symbol of classification, and then each country can have a couple different ones. As you'll notice here, Grana Padano is the largest in terms of millions of pounds produced as a PDO, followed by a Parmigiano Reggiano. So Grana Padano is an interesting one because, as I was saying to you before, it's the most popular PDO in terms of millions of pounds being produced. But in the United States, it's easily to argue that the most famous Italian cheese is Parmigiano Reggiano. Grana Padano does a lot of advertising. I see him on cooking shows. I see him in magazines. I see it everywhere. And Grana stands for a grainy consistency. It can only be made with partially skimmed milk. And it dates back to the turn of the last millennium, around 1150 AD. And it only took a couple hundred years before it became the most popular cheese in Italy. And that would be true today. If you went there, you would see it everywhere. Pecorino Romano, quickly, I think, to touch on that. Pecco is just kind of fun to learn. It means sheep in Italian, and the milk comes from the countryside of Lazio and Sardinia. Picture the Rome area, the greater Rome area, and an island off the western side of Italy. It can only be made with whole milk from sheep's milk, and it has to be aged for a minimum of 5 months before packaging. What I wanted to touch on here, and the reason for the map, is you'll kind of see in the lower left, you see Pecorino Romano there. The farther south you go, the more arid climates that you have, you'll have more goats and sheep's milk style cheeses. They can handle the arid climate. The farther north you go, the lusher greens, the cooler temperatures, you can have cows. So there are many, many PDOs from France. We're not going to go through them all, but you can have Comté, Roquefort, Saint Nectaire, Bleu de Verne, Camembert de Normandy, Ossau-Arati, Morbier, and Epoisse. And I'm just saying that just in case any of my old teammates are secretly listening, showing off that I can pronounce them all. Comté, from a very high level to keep it moving, is the most famous cheese of France. And it's aged in Fort de Rus, which was fortresses built by Napoleon more than a couple hundred years ago. You could call it a Swiss-style cheese in the way that it tastes. But what's interesting about this slide is you see at the bottom there is a green band, and that is how it's measured for quality. I believe the scale is up to 20, and 15 to 20 or 16 to 20 means that you get a green belt, or the highest quality of Comte available. Roquefort is a sheep's milk blue cheese from France. And the reason I wanted to share and talk about this one a little bit is it has a unique story. All cheeses, especially imported cheeses, have origin stories. So the caves of Roquefort, as you see in the middle picture here, there was a wheel of cheese, there was a piece of bread, the bread got moldy, the mold jumped to the cheese, and voila. That's one story and one version of how blue cheese was born. Roquefort, because it's sheep's milk cheese, will have a very tangy, a bit of a sharper experience than a traditional cow's milk blue cheese. So Morbier, you see in the lower left that line down the middle of the cheese. It is vegetable ash. And again, cheeses had been made before there were sub-zero refrigerators. So they would take the morning milk, put the vegetable ash on it, in the afternoon milk, and that line was the demarcation of how to separate that. You'll notice here, so the Comte that we were talking about in the middle on the right side, that's closer to a mountain cheese. And so if you can picture the Alps, to the east is Switzerland. That's a very mountainous region. DOP for the United Kingdom. As I was saying before, every cheese has a story. And two things that I want to call out here is that the story goes that the owner of the Bell Inn had a cheese by a lady of the name of Elizabeth Scarborough while visiting her factory or her cheesemaker nearby, loved it so much that she wanted to acquire the rights to it, did acquire the rights to it, and soon was marketing this massively throughout all of the UK and soon then the world. What you'll notice about Stilton versus the Gorgonzola versus the Roquefort, some of the other blue cheeses, is that there is an edible rind on the outside. That is a unique characteristic of aging and of processing that cheese. The blue Stilton will be a little bit drier of an experience than a Roquefort or perhaps a Danish style blue. And I'm just going to cover Manchego. So Manchego is one of the most popular Spanish cheeses in the US. It has to be made in La Mancha from a very specific sheep, the Manchega sheep, and it has to be 100% sheep's milk, which makes it very expensive. So while it's easy to argue that it's the most popular Spanish cheese in the United States, when you go to Spain, something that's 100% sheep's milk is rather expensive. So they'll eat cheeses more similar to like an Iberico, which is a mixed milk of all three, cow, sheep, and goat. This is one of my favorite cheeses, and it's very common. Most of this version in the United States is sold as a 3-month, but you can get up to a year aged as you can most aged cheeses. If there's questions on Emmentaler, I know that Daniel could answer the specifics, but what's interesting about Emmentaler is that this cheese can be made in, the wheels are anywhere from 165 to 265 pounds. And because Switzerland is so mountainous, this is more of a logistics issue too, of being able to take the milk, process the milk up high, and then being able to take a product down below to the market to sell. Also, as the story goes, it's for tax purposes. So like today, taxes are a percentage of a sale price. Emmentaler, if you make a several 100-pound wheel, you only got taxed per piece, which is another reason why this wonderful cheese was made. And one of the other key characteristics of it is that the holes for this are near cherry sized. I don't want to run over or take away from anyone else's time, so I will stand down for now.
Thank you very much, Brian. And obviously, there's a lot of information we can spend on any of these cheeses that you presented. Brian, I appreciate you taking the time, and thank you on the Emmentaler story. You're absolutely correct. It started out to be a 200-pound wheel because the taxation being on one piece. So they made the cheese as big as they possibly could. So you don't need my expertise anymore. You got it fully covered. So good. All right. Now we are going to start the individual cheese presentations. So I hope, or I'll give you another minute or two to make sure you have your cheese board out, your cheese knife out, and the first cheese, the king of the cheese, Parmigiano Reggiano, properly placed, because at the end of Mike Duda's presentation, you will actually and finally get to eat and taste some cheese rather than just hearing about it. So Mike, if you would take over, please, and educate us on Parmigiano Reggiano from Italy.
Sure. Just hopefully everyone could see the presentation, and we'll hop right into this. So we'll jump down into some of the fun facts and production. Parmigiano Reggiano, often referred to as the king of cheese, although I saw that about a couple cheeses in the presentation there. But again, origins date back to the monks of the Middle Ages. The most important thing about Parmigiano Reggiano is that it can only be produced in the provinces over here of Parma, Reggio Emilia, Modena, Bologna to the left of the Reno River, and Mantua to the right of the Po River. So that's the only region where this can happen. The cattle are fed only the local grasses and hay in that area. No silage is allowed. So different months of production, you could kind of taste the subtle differences of what the cows are eating, and the milk fat percentages and such will vary a little bit because of that. So it truly is an artisanal cheese. And when we talk about the making, we'll get into that a bit more. The traditions have not changed other than a couple minor innovations, like instead of heating the copper vats with fire, they're now steam heated. It's governed by a consortium dating back to 1934 and 1954. It is a PDO cheese. It's naturally aged a minimum of 12 months, but often over 24 months. And it has a complex nutty flavor with a crunchy consistency. One of the things we didn't talk about is geographical indicators and all that, which we're not going to get into today. But in Europe, it is Grana Padano and Parmigiano Reggiano are two of the cheeses that could be called Parmesan. Not the case here in the US. So we'll quickly get into the process of how Parmigiano Reggiano is made. It's actually made with, you take the morning milking and you mix that with the naturally skimmed milk of the previous evening's milking. And so that's why it's considered a partially skimmed cheese. So basically the cream rises to the top, that's skimmed, they make butter or mascarpone with it, and it's mixed with the morning milk. The only ingredients that go into Parmigiano Reggiano are the calf rennet, which is used to coagulate the milk, like Brian got into earlier, and the whey culture is a starter, and that's from the previous day's production. So, you have your cheese, you have your whey. Some of the whey goes to feed the pigs to make prosciutto di Parma and things like that. And then some of the whey actually goes back and is what gives Parmigiano Reggiano its flavor. So after the milk is nice and coagulated, the cheesemaker will cut the curd with this tool called the spino over here. You can see the picture where the cheesemaker is in fact cutting the curd there. It is then heat treated, so it's heated but not pasteurized, to about 55 degrees C in that centigrade. That's where the curds separate from the whey. And after settling, the cheesemaker takes a giant cheesecloth and pulls the big curd from the bottom. And from there, that is cut in half. So one of these vats, one of these giant stainless steel vats, will produce 2 wheels of Parmigiano Reggiano. That's it. So very different than massive US productions of Parmesan. And so they will then get wrapped with this white mold, to form the cheese. And on here, it has the signature pin dot Parmigiano Reggiano words with a factory number and a month and year of production. So After that, the cheese is submerged. So that sets up for a couple hours, and then the cheese is submerged into a brine where it will stay in brine for a couple weeks. And from there, it's shipped to cure rooms from aging. So continuing on with this, the cheese is then sent to a cure room. You can see kind of in the picture behind me too. Here's one where there's thousands and thousands of wheels of Parmigiano Reggiano. And as I mentioned, the cheese is governed by a consortio. So it's up to that consortio, the cheese experts, to make sure that the product does in fact meet the strict and stringent quality standards that Parmigiano Reggiano holds itself to. So the consortio will come in and they will tap the wheels, and what they do when they're tapping is they listen for imperfections in the wheel. So if the paste has large cracks, hollow points, holes, that will not bear the Great Consortio seal, and they will actually scrape. They will scrape the pin dotting as much as possible off of there. If it does, in fact, meet the standards, then it gets branded, and then you could see the words Parmigiano Reggiano go along with it, and then it goes into aging facilities for further cure. It isn't just like, oh, we're going to sit it on a shelf and come back to it 2 years later. There's constant TLC that goes on here, that there's machines that go and pull the wheels off of the shelves. It brushes off their wire brushes off any mold, puts them back on the shelf, and they're constantly reviewed throughout aging. So now the fun part is we could taste some of this. So the piece that was shipped to you is actually, I believe, a 24-month. Mine actually has the cool, let's see if I could get this on the screen, but I'm struggling, but I could actually see the letters MAR on here, so I know this was a March production. Probably, very few people were lucky enough to see that, but, because it'll only be on one of every however many samples there. Typically, if the cheese is greater than 18 months, you will notice it is sweet, yet acidic. There's typically fruity notes in Parmigiano Reggiano. People will typically associate it with a bruised apple or a pineapple-y note, depending on, the factory and whatnot. Sometimes it's fruity fermented, almost like a fermented grape. You could, depending on the piece, pick up notes of roasted nuts. It could have a slight little burn kind of in the back of your throat. Sometimes that may taste a little bit like that cow note. Some people say they taste that. And lastly, as we mentioned, it is a granular cheese. It is crumbly. You might notice that there's some little crystals in the cheese that develop with the age. They're naturally occurring tyrosine crystals there. Everything intensifies with age. And just real quick on some pairings and whatnot for wine, works great with sparkling whites, medium body whites, low alcohol cocktails. If it's a very aged cheese, you probably want to go with intense dry fruits, figs, apricots, plum, maybe balsamic vinegar. So that's what I have, and I'm going to taste my piece and savor it and enjoy it, and we'll answer questions later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mike, and let everyone enjoy this delicacy from Italy. And one of the learnings I already have is, and I made a note, it is fantastic to have the cheese. It is fantastic to have our experts talking about the cheese, but we clearly need the adult beverage next to it as well, since Mike showed us what best to pair his Parmigiano Reggiano with. So we'll make sure for the next one we have that added.
Yeah, I was debating showing up with a glass of wine, but chose not to.
Yeah, that's quite fine. No, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I hope you get to taste this unique cheese. And as we go through, you will also, and that was the idea as well, we could have taken obviously 20 cheeses, and I know time is already slightly beyond what we'd planned for it. But with the 4 cheeses that we picked, we wanted to show the nuances within these different type of cheeses. They're all cow's milk, but they're uniquely different. And I hope by you getting to taste it, you can understand those nuances as well. And now our next cheese being presented by Izzy is the Gouda from Holland. Izzy, if you would please.
Okay, so we are heading a little bit north here to look at Gouda. So Gouda. Okay, so Gouda is a very, very old cheese. First historical mentions of this cheese date back all the way to 1184. It is one of the world's oldest recorded cheeses that is still in production these days. So just some fun facts here. Gouda was traditionally, the cheese making was left to the women in the Netherlands, and the recipes were passed down from mothers to daughters. And that is how this cheese continues these days. So like many European cheeses, Gouda is named after the city of Gouda, but not because it was made there. So that's a difference from some of the other cheeses out there. The reason that it got the name Gouda, or Gouda, the correct way to pronounce it, the Dutch way, a little more guttural sound there, Gouda. So basically, towns in the Netherlands were given different markets that they could have, and Gouda had the monopoly on the sale of Gouda. So cheesemakers would travel from all over the country and all over Holland to sell on market days. The wheels are displayed, as you can see up here, kind of in the corner, top corner here. These wheels are being inspected and shown by the cheesemakers. And they'd be weighed, priced, and deals would be sealed by a handshake. You can still see these markets today. They go on. They're a little bit more of a tourist attraction than they were in the past when it was an actual market day, but it's a pretty cool little taste of history that we still have available to us there. So unlike Parmigiano Reggiano, Gouda does not have a DOP or PDO designation, and that means that it can have an incredibly large variation of different things going on with it. So it can be a young cheese, it can be an extra aged cheese, it can be made with cow's milk, sheep's milk, goat's milk, mixed milk, it can have flavors added into it, and all of those are still considered to be true Goudas. So that's a very, very differentiating factor than the Parmigiano Reggiano. And all of those things make every single one incredibly different and unique. So the age profiles, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get towards tasting the cheese, but some of them are very young, sweet, mellow, and others just get really intense and salty. So talking a little bit about the making process, Gouda is a wash curd pressed cheese. So they start with the milk, add starter cultures and rennet. Curds begin to form. The curds are then cut, stirred, some whey is removed, hot water is added to wash the curds, and this is a really important step for this. And then the curds are molded and pressed into shape. So washing the curds is important because it really helps to create a sweeter cheese by removing some of the extra lactic acid that there is in it. Pressing the cheese gives it its stereotypical texture and shape. So even though there's a huge variety of flavor profiles and age profiles for Gouda, almost every single one is in this iconic shape. And they're almost always wax covered as well. So fun facts here, molded curds need pressure of at least 5 times the weight of the curd during pressing, which helps to create that stereotypical flattened wheel here. And I have an image of just one style of a cheese press here that you can look at, and right next to that wheel of cheese, just to get an idea of what they look like. And then the hot water used to wash the curds helps to reduce the lactose in the curds, which in turn leads to that less lactic acid in the cheese. And that is really what makes the cheese so much sweeter. So Gouda age profiles, like I mentioned, there's an incredible variation. So a lot of people are familiar with Gouda, the young Gouda variety, which is the typical red wax, really pliable, supple texture to it. It's sweet, mild, really lactic, milky flavors, super approachable, and it's a great melter. As it ages, Gouda's texture and flavor and the color all considerably change. Most of them become more intense with that aging process. You can kind of see how it becomes more brittle in that middle bottom picture there. The colors are really deep golden colors. And one of my favorite things about them is the flavors and how they develop there. So where the young Goudas are pretty mellow, an aged Gouda can be incredibly complex, and you'll get flavors like salted caramel, butterscotch, some nuttiness. And one of my absolute favorite things about the aged Goudas is that they are typically full of tyrosine crystals, which are those little crunchy bits that are kind of salty, you know? And tyrosine is a precursor to dopamine, which means that cheese, like Gouda, actually makes you happy. So let's get on to a couple pairings and tastings and go ahead and try this beautiful little cheese that we have here, our Gouda. So for food pairings, whole grain mustard, especially with the young Gouda, is one of my absolute favorites. And that's a contrasting flavor pairing there. I also like to complement the flavor profiles as well. So apricot jams go really well with young Goudas as well. With the more aged versions, dark chocolates and really deep roasty flavors tend to pair beautifully. So you can go really simple, throw on some dark chocolate under your cheese board, or even better, great homemade brownies with an aged Gouda is perfect. Another item I love with the aged Goudas in particular are some beverages pairings. So for me, it's a little too early for wine to pair with our cheese for this tasting, but I have a cup of coffee here, and coffee pairs beautifully with this cheese here. So it really brings out kind of, like I said, those roasty, toasty notes there. Saisons and wheat beers are another one that pair really well as well, especially with kind of the younger ones, and nut brown ales and porters, kind of those darker ones, more reminiscent of those coffee flavor profiles, really stand up to those salted caramel deep flavors. If you want to go really intense, bourbon and scotch make great pairings as well. So with that, let's eat some cheese. This one is actually a good middle ground age profile. It's not too aged, it's not too young. You can kind of start to see those tyrosine crystals starting to form, but it is still a pretty supple paste there. And looking forward to digging into it, and hope you guys enjoy it as well.
Thank you very much, Izzy. Fantastic. And again, a couple of minutes perhaps for you to also savor, taste the difference again from the Parmigiano Reggiano to the Gouda. And now I can actually introduce myself, talk a little bit about the Gruyere. I essentially could have simply taken Mike's presentation on the Parmigiano Reggiano, as it is very similar in the making. To begin with quickly, what does it mean Gruyere? What does it mean AOP? AOP is the equivalent to a PDO. It's just a French word for it, but it's exactly the same rules and regulations. It is very specific for an area that the cheese can be made. And there is actually a AOP, an organization to manage the entire production. And that starts with milk, that starts with the cheese making, and that also includes the affineur, as Brian explained earlier. So the Le Gruyere cheese is made with fresh raw milk as well. Similarly, the farms, they can only be 10 miles away from the actual dairy. There's an 18-page rule book as to how this cheese is being made. I understand I only have 7 minutes, so therefore I'm not going to go through 18 pages, but there's very specifics, and one of the main specifics is that, again, the milk has to come from farms that are within 10 miles of the actual cheese maker. So very fresh milk is being delivered in the evening, stays overnight, gets combined with the morning milk when the cheese making actually starts. And the cheesemaker makes one Gruyere, right? And what I mean by that, he makes a 70-pound wheel. Depending on the size of the dairy, he may make 5 wheels a day, he may make 30 wheels a day, but he makes one wheel of 70 pounds every single day. Same format, same recipe. We talked about the designation as well. The AOP measures, checks exactly how this cheese is being made, and we'll see a little bit later the certification, similarly to what Brian said on the Comté cheese. It is all about the region. Again, that's basically what an AOP stands for. It is the western part of Switzerland that exclusively makes Gruyere cheese. And again, you see the same copper vats as you have seen on the Parmigiano Reggiano. What does it mean, the AOP label, when you go to the store and buy a piece of Gruyere, whether it is that you actually see the wheel or whether you buy a pre-cut portion in a supermarket? When it has the AOP label on the product, that does guarantee that the product is made under these rules and regulations coming out of Switzerland every single time. So how is Gruyere being made? What are the characters? Similarly, again, it's a longer aged cheese. So it starts with milk, it gets pressed again. It gets a salt bath, right? And it then gets aged at a minimum. In order for it to be called and sold under the AOP rules and regulations, it has to age 3 months at the cheesemaker themselves, and for another 2.5 months afterwards at the affineur. And what you see on the picture here is the care each wheel gets. It's a simple salt water solution that the cheese gets washed with and keeps it moist, keeps the cheese also clean of the mold of it that develops, but it also develops the flavor profile. Another characteristic is the cheese is aged solely and exclusively on wood boards. Again, part of those 18-page rules and regulations, it has to age on a wood board. Here's the picture of the brine tank. That's the salt bath. And the interesting part actually is some of the water actually is, could be 5, could be 10 years. And all they do at the dairy is they actually add salt, because the salt gets absorbed by the cheese during 24, 36 hours, but the water never gets changed. I know of a dairy that moved location within a town in Switzerland, and they actually got brand new equipment from a cheese making perspective, but they transferred their brine tank water, the water itself. So the tank, they got a new one, but it has so much bacteria, so much good stuff in that salt water that they wanted to keep the actual brine itself and transferred the brine to the new dairy. It's unique, these little village dairies, what they do, but that's one of the really interesting aspects of it. Again, I talked about the 5 months. The specific appearances is also measured again by height, by weight, all under the rules and regulations that every single cheesemaker has to follow. Profile, again, depending on the age, we have a minimum of 5.5 months aged Gruyere, all the way up to 18, some even beyond 18 months of age. So depends a little bit on the aging of each cheese, but there's certainly fruity notes. There's caramelized onion flavors as well that you would find. Just a couple of numbers on the cheese itself. The feed was also described before. The cows are not allowed to feed on any silage. So it is in summertime fresh grass, they're outside. And in wintertime, because it is Switzerland, we have frozen, snow-covered fields. They do eat the hay off the same ground they would normally feed on during summertime. And what's also uniquely interesting here is, in order to be sold officially under AOP rules or name of AOP, you have to have at least 18 points. And there's 4 categories, you see them here, and there is a committee from the AOP who goes to the affineurs to actually rate the cheese. And the closer you get to the maximum of 20 points, the more money the cheesemaker gets. So internally, they set this up quite nicely. you make better cheese, maximum 20 points, you get more money for that cheese. So there's an interest for the cheesemaker to make good cheese. There's interest for the farmer to deliver good milk for the cheesemaker to make good cheese. What happens if it's below 18 points? If it is below 18 points, it cannot be sold with the Le Gruyère AOP name on it, and it mostly gets used to make fondue or for grating. That's the option. Every cheese maker has its own facility number engraved in the wheel, so very easily identifiable. Where is your cheese coming from? You can go on the website. Le Gruyère AOP has its own website. You have a 4-digit cheese number. You can find out who the master cheesemaker is who made that particular wheel of cheese. I had to add some adult beverage here since my colleagues already have done as well. It is mostly the Riesling and the Chardonnay. Both wines are actually made in the western part of Switzerland as well. So you're not only getting to enjoy the cheese from the western part of Switzerland, but you also get the wine with it. And that is covering Gruyère. Please open your piece of cheese from Murray's. Enjoy the Gruyère. This particular Gruyère you're tasting is a 10-month-old. So again, it's a little bit on the firmer side, more stronger flavor side. And you may also see some of those crystals coming through, similarly to what Mike said on the Parmigiano Reggiano. And now to close out our presentation on cheeses, would like to ask Brian back to talk about Brie from France.
Thank you very much. My couple of slides here are not as beautiful as everyone else's, but hopefully I can tell a story that's quite unique and interesting. So Brie originated near Paris, and it was, or still is, by some of the PDOs, an unpasteurized farm-produced product such as a Brie de Meaux or a Brie de Moulin. And it is, those cheeses, the Brie de Meaux is traditionally artisan made to this day, 30 miles east of Paris in the region of Ile-de-France, which is also a brand name that some of you might recognize from certain shopping centers. And Brie has a history that goes back over 1,200 years. So just touching on some of that a little bit, because it can be quite interesting. And I'll specifically gossip about Brie de Meaux. It was first created in the Middle Ages by monks, as we've heard several times here today. And monks created a lot of cheeses and foods throughout history, in particular in wartime, as they were unaffected by the local happenings. And the reputation began in supposedly 774 by a French emperor who I think everyone has heard of before, Charlemagne. He stopped at a priory, like a modern day monastery, and discovered this cheese, and it pleased him so much that he asked it to be regularly delivered to his castle. So it goes back to Charlemagne. There was another king, French king, who judged the cheese to be so excellent that he sent 200 pounds of Brie de Meaux to all the members of the court as New Year's gifts. And as a little joke, I always find this funny. There was a famous French poet who was a lover of the cheese, but not of France. And he said that Brie de Meaux is the only good thing to come out of this country. Now to kind of take it to a quick TMZ style gossip column, Brie de Meaux hasn't just been adored by the French. King Henry IV also fell under the whimsical spell of this cheese, you could say. And the king discovered it when he was having dinner with the queen. And the story goes that he enjoyed it so much that the queen always requested that the cheese be served to please her husband, because according to legend, he favored eating this brie over being with his mistress. So I'll get off the gossip column now, but always made me chuckle. No reason to sit on it at all other than please get the brie and the knife, and I'll kind of walk you through it a little bit. But as we've said, when you're serving cheese in general, and particularly brie, you want to take it out of the refrigerator about an hour before eating it. And if we have a wheel or we have a wedge here, but if you're serving a wheel, you would take the wheel, they usually can come in maybe an 8-ounce round, and cut a little bit of a wedge size. And that way it gives your guests an idea of an appropriate serving size. Or when you have a wedge like we do today, you wouldn't want to just cut the tip off. You would want to cut a long slice if you can, because the most flavorful part is probably the inside. And then that way you're ensuring that everyone gets a part of the cheese. The French will traditionally serve their brie, and this is also common with all the rest of the cheeses. When you're tasting a cheese, you want to taste it with a crusty bread, or mostly important, something that doesn't overpower the cheese. And you can pair it with things that are acidic, like fruits and apples and grapes and pears. And oftentimes you'll find it on a standard charcuterie board as well. The go-to beverage pairing, since we're talking about booze, is champagne, but it also can pair well with soft and fruity red wines, such as a Pinot Noir, or an acidic white wine like a Sauvignon Blanc, or perhaps if alcohol isn't on the menu, you can even use some apple or grape juice. Being conscious of the time, I think that's good for brie.
Thank you, Brian, once again. Very much appreciated. And please continue tasting the different cheeses. I think there were nice portions provided, so do enjoy those. Just want to take a couple of more minutes, if I may. I know it's 2 o'clock now. Above and beyond, I would like to thank the presenters who took the time out as well to prepare some of the slides, some of the dialogue. I would also like to thank all of you for taking the time. Again, we're all very busy. I understand that fully and do appreciate that you took the time. I also hope that it was educational indeed.